welcome folks here. My name is Daryl Sieplinga. Ron's going to get us officially started, and then we'll get going.
All right. Well, my name is Ron Kool, and I'm one of the pastors here. Welcome to all of you, and welcome to those of you who are joining us online. All right. So, again, a little bit of the history that goes into why we're here tonight, once again, discussing this topic, and part of it is that it's been one that churches churches have had to deal with, the topic of homosexuality and transgender and any number of other things, but all related to human sexuality and so on. As a denomination, our church has, had a history of in 1973 having a report. And then we had another report that was commissioned, I think it was 2016. It was supposed to come in 2019 to Synod. It didn't. It was delayed a year. And then with COVID, it was delayed another year. And so some of this is just because the church has been talking about it broadly, different denominations. Most denominations have been going through it or talking about it and trying to figure out what to do. And denominations and churches need to make some decisions about it. Christians disagree, and how are we going to handle it? How do we love each other? What does it mean? And so in our own denomination, again, in 1973, the position was taken that it kind of had two main parts to it. One was that a person is not necessarily responsible for their sexual orientation. In other words, somebody doesn't necessarily choose to be homosexual, that they more often discover it, that they just realize that's how they are. And so they said, a person is not necessarily responsible for the feelings of it, but the decision was biblically they should not act on homosexual feelings. So homosexual activity would be something that would be a sin outside of God's will. And so at that point, in a sense, a homosexual person who's celibate could, and we did, there were homosexual members who were celibate, who were pastors, could serve in various officers, but they had to make a commitment to celibacy. As time went on, that gets talked about in a number of, again, different denominations and so on. The culture becomes much more accepting and affirming, and so churches are looking at this again. Again, that group was appointed then in 2016. They came back with a report that basically said on this question of homosexuality that we continue to hold to what we held to in 1973. That a person is not necessarily, it's not something they necessarily choose, but we don't think that we should approve of and affirm homosexual activity. So that was what the denomination decided. And then as a church, we have people here, some of whom would say, no, I think affirming is the right way to be, and others who would say, no, it's not. And so we said, we have to have some discussions here. And the council talked about it. We had some meetings with folks, and council decided, all right, our sense is that it's best for Hillside not to be affirming. We are going to hold to the traditional position. So we're just going to take what the denomination had said and say, we're not going to be affirming of homosexual activity. We're going to try to love homosexual people. We know we've had kids here who grew up who are homosexuals. I'm sure we have others, kids who are right now who are homosexuals. We're going to love them. We're going to walk with them. We're going to care deeply about them, but we're not going to approve of, we're not going to do marriages. We're not going to affirm that as an activity that we think God approves of. So then the next question came of, all right, what about people who disagree? Can they still serve at the council level? And previously in our denomination, for the most part, that was always left up to the individual council. To say, hey, look, and so let's say that you didn't agree with the confessions on baptism, saying we ought to baptize infants, or rebaptism, that we don't do rebaptisms. What we would generally do in a situation like that is to say, well, as long as you don't teach something that's contrary to what we believe, if long as you'll defend the church's position, you can serve. And so the formal way to get at that was something called a gravamen or a gravamen. But for the most part, that was kind of done informally in a lot of places where it was just, and so I've said Andy Pasma, who's our executive administrator here, Andy was raised Baptist, he's still a Baptist. Now he's not going to talk about it, and so on, so I don't have a...
You make him talk about it.
I make him talk about it, but he could probably defend infant baptism better than most of us because he's well aware of the situation. And he's fine without, and again, he and Deanna have said they're not going to have any more kids. And so that's, kind of, but it's, and so that's how it had been handled. Part of, and so at the denominational level, they asked that question and they said, well, we don't think we should handle things that way anymore. We think that if they don't agree, then they shouldn't be on. And it wasn't just, I think people who were saying that were thinking primarily about this issue. But you don't get to just say, well, on this issue, yes, that, without defining it. And so that created some questions about, all right, well, what do we do as a church? And some of it is the denominational discussions aren't done. That still is, not in terms of being affirming or not. At this point, that's settled for now. It can come up again sometime, perhaps in the future. But in terms of, because again, people are starting to realize, well, hold on, we didn't mean that. All right, well, then we got to clarify. So there will be some more decisions coming. So Hillside said, what do we do about council members? Up to this point, we've said, look, as long as you support the church's position. Well, now do we have that option or don't we? When Synod ended, they always come out with something called the frequently asked questions. At least they have the last 4 years. These are some questions people have. And the original one said, nope, you can't disagree on anything. And about 2 months later, they came out and said, well, hold on. We can't quite live that way because we don't always think the same. I sometimes say, I'm not 100% sure on this or 100% sure on that. The main things, yeah, but on all of these things that, there can be 10,000 of them in the creeds and confessions, depending on how you break it out. Can I be sure on all these things all the time? And if I'm not, then I have to quit? Well, so then they came out and said, well, no, there's some room there. So we said, okay, how are we going to handle it? Is that at a place where we say, let's stay in the denomination, and at this point, or do we say, no, let's move someplace else? Because, one way of reading it would be, I don't know of any person. Well, I know I couldn't. I'll put it that way. Who could say, I am always 100% on all these things all the time. Sometimes I think, maybe this, the baptism thing or whatever, and I'm not going to practice different. I'm not going to whatever, but I'm going to talk about it, teach about it, and I'm not sure it matters all that much. And so, if that got cut off, then we said, can we stay with integrity in the denomination? Well, that's opened a bit more, and now we're trying to figure out, okay, we hold to the same position as the denomination. The question is, how do we do that? And is there room for us to allow some level? And different churches are attempting different things. Some churches have defined what it means to say, this is big enough that you shouldn't serve on council. I know of one church that has said, if you feel like you need to talk publicly about it, that's the line. Then you shouldn't serve on council. But if you're willing to not promote a position different than the church, we think it's still similar to what we've kind of had for the past, as long as you don't teach different than the church. And so a number of us are all trying to figure out how to do this. Council appointed a group, and again, some of it was Hillside, when we talk about things like the vibrancy and so on, and I mean, a lot of it, it's like, God, we've got a good thing going here. We don't want to start drawing lines everywhere. I think we take the right lines seriously. I mean, again, on things that matter, that are clearly gospel-centered. Jesus died on the cross, paid for our sins. His blood washes away. Yeah, we all agree on that. Within that, there's room to discuss. And so just trying to figure, it felt like we weren't sure we could be who we've been for the last 50 years or whatever with what the denomination was saying. And so trying to figure out how that goes. It was interesting, just real quick, yesterday or Sunday with ordaining Mornay. I think he's in college, but a young man who grew up here, and he came up to me and he said, well, right after the service, he came and said, well, why did he have to agree to everything? Don't we want to have some people who challenge us and encourage us? And I said, well, that's a great question. I said, there are some things that he has to agree to. I said, that Jesus rose from the dead, and then there are some things that we have room to learn and grow, and different practices and whatnot. And he said, oh, okay, good, that makes sense. But I thought it's interesting that he kind of, without realizing he was touching on something that's been a huge subject the last year and a half, he named it. And I thought, well, good for him. I was really excited that he paid that much attention and that he put together saying, what does it mean when he says that? And so, so council said, all right, how are we going to do this? And there was, in some ways, say, well, we can just say this is what we're going to do. But I think what the council felt like was we wanted to say, let's not just immediately say that. Let's actually explore and think about why. We might have a gut instinct about what we ought to do. But let's think about it and try to explore that. And so we used a process that is one that Ken Tameling has used before, Daryl has used before as well, to try to just explore different options. And I'm going to let them talk about that. Any questions on what I've said?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll kind of add in. Ron and I said we were going to wing it a little bit today, so we will. So, and one of the things is we made a decision at council multiple years ago that we'd accept a variety of positions on a variety of issues to be in leadership. Wanted to still do that. And in fact, and I'll just speak personally, one of the things I appreciate about Hillside is that on a variety of issues, we have a pretty broad, not in the world sense, but in Christian churches sense, we have pretty broad perspectives on different issues, whether that's, these kinds of issues that we're talking about now or political issues. And I appreciate that. And I think that's good and healthy. And so that's just kind of my own statement about that in terms of why I think thought it was important to at least study this with some deliberation and integrity. And Ken, you're there in the Ethernet, and so you'll correct us whenever we stray. But we want to talk about the process that we used, who the planning team was, what that foresight scenario planning is, what are the factors that we looked at and studied as a part of it, then what our recommendation was, which you've heard on some of our council updates in terms of where we landed, and then how we're implementing that and what the implications are for us kind of moving forward, and then some time for questions and answers. So that's what we hope to accomplish today. So here's the team and the process. So council members are listed on the screen. Number of council members, 2 members of the long-range planning team, and 2 staff members were a part of a group that agreed to meet. We did a bait and switch with them. We set 3 meeting dates that we were going to have, and then we added a 4th. So we met 4 times during November and December. I think it was October, November. And then we and pretty lengthy meetings. So that group committed to that process with the idea that they would, in some respects, everybody comes with a certain idea. Well, I know what we should do. Or almost all of us come to a situation where we know exactly what we should do. And if people would just pay attention to me, we could make these meetings end quicker and we can move on. We ask people to set aside their biases. And so we use this tool, thanks to Ken for helping shepherd us through this, that, made sure we looked at what different future options might look like. And then also think about, well, here we know what these future options, but there may be some wild cards down the road. If Synod would make some other changes one way or another, we need to at least be ready for and consider those things. So we did that as well. And the idea is we want to make sense of uncertainty and bring some system to the process. And so that we wanted to do that. I'll spare you all reading the screen because you can see that, but that's the overall process. So here's how we used the process. So what we wanted to do is we looked at past decisions and potential future developments from Synod, looked at that together, and then from that created 4 possible solutions. Again, people perhaps came in with certain biases to one or more of these. We asked them to set those aside and kind of suspend disbelief for a bit. Option 1, follow Synod's decision exactly as published. Now what's published in the Synod decision, and then what has come out in some frequently released, frequently asked questions, right? Because they've done several iterations of those frequently asked questions about how to implement that. And Ron, we had the benefit of Ron having been at Synod, and Ron kept saying, well, I know what it says in the recommendation, but I don't think that's what they meant. Ron's ever the optimist, and I appreciate that about him. But if we followed the decision exactly as published, we couldn't, so that was one option. And that was in some ways, that's an easy option. It says what it says, we do what it says. Option 2 is stay in the CRC, but follow Synod's directives with some room for the council to make some determination of whether an office bearer can serve. So having the council make a determination if individual issues come up. Option 3 is leave the denomination and go a non-denominational route. Option 4, leave the denomination and join a different denomination, which maybe would give us greater freedom. So, and then we also created for each option, should have brought, for each option, we created an implementation plan. And for each option, we said, what if Synod moves this way or that way? How does that impact that? And we studied that. So on each of those decisions, we spent 1 week, 2.5 hour or so meeting. Thanks, Allison, for being a part of that. On option 1, studied that. Similarly on option 2, and then option 3 and 4, we did together. And then on the 4th meeting, we came together and said, okay, what's going to be our recommendation for the denomination? Is he? Good. So here were the key considerations that we laid out and scored on each of those. What's the impact on our strategic plan and our mission and vision? The discipleship goal, outreach goal, and authentic community goal. How does making a decision on each of those, thanks, Mark. We'll see if it makes any difference. How does making that decision impact that one way or another? Does that make us, does that enhance what we do if we make this decision, or does that inhibit what we do in each of those areas? We also said, okay, if we make this decision, and we did this for all 4, how might that impact future office bearers in the pool of future office bearers Would it restrict us, or would it enhance our ability to attract a broad pool of future office bearers? What might it do to our future attendance and membership? That is, when we evaluated those separately. And then what's the impact on our staff retention and staff recruitment? How might that change as a result of each of those decisions? And then again, on each of those decisions, how might it impact the giving and the budget? Now, not all of those factors are equal, right? Some factors are more important than others, but they're all factors that at least need to be considered. Now, I'm going to show you kind of a summary of the ratings, but don't get too foaming at the mouth about this summary at the ratings and think that it's gospel.
Let me jump in a second.
Good.
You take a drink.
Good, thank you. Cheers.
One of those, for example, to think about attendance, the fact of the matter is we know, and we've had this, that for some folks, even by deciding whether to be affirming or not, if we said, well, if we think we should become an affirming church, with that decision, that we would have some folks who would leave if we did that. We have had some folks leave when we've said, we're not affirming. We've had some folks say, I want to go to an affirming church. I have people who I know who I love who are gay or lesbian, and I want to invite them to my church, and I won't feel comfortable doing that here. And so those are real. I mean, we have people who are in both of those situations, and I just to let you know that there are people who and I don't think. I go back to when we did the women in office discussion and opened up the offices of elder and pastor to women. We had some people leave then, but they also left saying, we love you, we don't think you're, but for us, this is important enough, we feel like we need to find a different church. I think that's the same sense of anybody who I've talked to who's left is saying, no, I understand what Hillside did and why they did it, and I think that's maybe best for Hillside. I feel like I need to be in a different place. So that can happen without it being rancor and fighting, and but you kind of have to make a decision, and you just do the best you can with it.
But as a reminder, in these conversations, we weren't making those determinations about whether Hillside was going to be affirming or not. We were making a decision about how does that impact our relationship to each other and our relationship to the denomination. And we recognized that. I had people contact me and said, well, if you leave, recognizing we were studying these, if you leave the CRC, I'm out. I had other people come in and said, if you stay, would you stay with the CRC? If you stay with the CRC, I'm out. So even without changing what our stance was, we knew that there were implications either way, and we had to measure those. And so as I started to say, thanks, Mark, this did help. As I started to say, before I show the next slide, this was a process that took what is some subjective judgments that we all made and then came to an agreement and, did some mathematical wizardry and that kind of thing. But it took subjective decisions about each of those factors and made them into an objective measure, right? They were our best guess, and we gave it a rating. And so here's how, and there are a whole bunch of numbers behind each of those, but if we just average all factors weighting the same, options 2 and 4 rated highest, tied. If we weighted them with some things being more important than others, the budget is, we have to have money to make the operation work. But that was one of the lowest rated things, right? I mean, the lowest weighted items in terms of our decision making. We didn't want how much money would be available or how we'd be impacted by giving.
Not all of us agreed with all the weighting.
That's a good point. So that was the initial role, and so I don't want you to take this rating to the bank, but I just wanted you to know that we did a rating and measured it, and that's how they came out. So obviously, option 2, stay in the CRC but allow council some flexibility, and option 4, leave the CRC, join another denomination, were the highest rated and very close. But then we considered a bunch of other factors as well. and kind of discussed and kind of measured ourselves against those and said, oh, what's the easiest to implement? How would it play? How would people respond to whatever decision we made, measuring what we did? What's the least disruptive on the short term? What would give us the most flexibility? I mean, for example, if you look at option 4 and option 2, option 4 scored slightly higher. But if we took that option, it leaves us very little flexibility in the future about where, how Synod might moderate their decision, which frankly we've seen, even I've witnessed in the intersynodical period that we're in. Synods, frequently asked questions have moderated more than they did when they first came out the door in July of 2024, in my view.
That sounds a lot like somebody was right.
It does. It does. And you can give that, you can score one.
And I might be proven wrong next year.
And so, the flexibility in the future weighed quite heavily on our group in terms of, hey, we don't want to make any rash decisions that we can't be flexible about. And then there are implementation hurdles for each option, some greater than others. Because I've had some people say, well, you guys kind of took the easy way out, didn't you? And we spent too much time to say that we took the easy way out.
Yeah.
Because I don't think we did, because we wrestled with it. And although it is and was the easiest to implement, it's not without challenges to implement. And we'll talk about that in a minute too. So then you've heard, if you've paid attention to the council updates, this is the council recommendation that we've made, and you kind of heard it coming and you knew it, and we said it, to remain in the CRC, but allow the council to have some flexibility to evaluate whether future office bearers, who still might wrestle with confessional issues. We didn't designate which confessional issue, we said with confessional issues, right? And so the rationale may be self-evident, but I'll put them up there.
Can I go back one thing real quick?
Yeah.
This was the recommendation to council that council adopted.
Right, council modified the precise recommendation. This is what council modified it to this.
Yeah, so this is the adopted.
Right.
This is not just a recommendation. Council's not recommending it. This is what council has decided.
Right. Yeah. Thanks. Clear. Yeah. I'll change that title on the next slide. On the next presentation. Yeah. So the rationale, you saw it was rated highly on our ability to fulfill mission, vision, and our 3 broad goals. True to who we are, we kind of looked at ourselves in the room and said, this is Hillside. This feels like Hillside. And there are people who with a lot more institutional memory of Hillside than I am, a relatively newcomer. We noted that Synod was challenged to clarify what confessional difficulty was, and they kind of said, hey, we'll leave it up to the church. And they actually said that. So that was the one area where you were right about that, Ron. It does honor our calling to care deeply for who we are and allows us to do that. In fact, you'll see in the implementation, it challenges us to figure out how to do that. It also gives us that flexibility. In 2 years, Synod is going to come back and say, must all members agree without reservation to all the confessional issues relative to members? And we kind of looked at that and said, if Synod comes back with that would make it even more challenging for us. But we wanted to have room to be able to act if that happened. We also believe it's important for us to continue to have a seat at the table, in the room where it happens, as it were, right? If we're Hamilton. We want to be able to be present where a decision is made and have representation there. And what does that mean? And there's a whole host of benefits of being a part of the Christian Reformed Church. Not all of us know that, and we also recognize that in some of the congregational meetings we had, somebody said, it took me 5 years before I even knew we were a Christian Reformed church here, right? And what does it mean that we're a Christian Reformed church? There are a lot of people still like that. But we recognize there's some benefit in being a part of the denomination. I mean, I grew up, was baptized in the denomination, and not always been a part of it, but most of my life. Provides flexibility for us for future decisions, and we think it allows us to be who we are. You can't read this probably, too small, but I put it up there anyway. So there are a number of things that we're going to do, and here we are doing the first thing, council feedback sessions with the congregation. So we're going to actually, believe me, we're going to pause to see if there are any questions, and so we will do that, promise, so that it really is feedback and not one way. We think, we've kind of charged mostly Ron with saying, hey, what are the guidelines that have to be true for, somebody ought to know when they're coming into council, what am I raising my hand and saying yes to? And we thought pretty good to start with our three major creeds, right? And maybe Ron will add some nuance to those. We'll see what he comes up with, and who knows?
Yeah, we will.
Right. We also recognize that we have to be probably a little bit more clear with future office bearers about what it means, because we don't want to have a bait and switch, right? Somebody said, well, I thought there was some flexibility, but wait a minute, is there flexibility in here? We want to be able to have some conversation. We recognize that we have to be clear about that, but we also need to be prepared. What if this does change our ability to attract office bearers? Because people say, I can't say yes to everything, and I don't want to mess with all that, decision making. It might be an easy pass for somebody to say, well, I don't want to serve. And if it does that, we might have to change even the structure of what the council looks like, and be flexible about that. And so that's a kind of an ongoing modification of that process. Will this decision impact our budget? We just have to continue to monitor that on an ongoing basis. Back in 1972, one of the things that Synod said was that churches need to learn to accept, love, welcome folks who were homosexuals, and learn how to do that. And we've been saying we need to do that since 1972. Is editorial commentary. I don't think we've done a very good job of knowing how to do that. And so one of the things that we've said that the council and others need to work on is, how can we work on loving our neighbors well and being recognized as loving our neighbors well, even as we've made the decisions that we've made? How can we recognize our homosexual brothers and sisters as part of the fellowship, and do that in a way that's effective? I don't think we've figured that out, but I think we need to figure it out. We said we needed to do it since 1972, and I don't think we have. We also, as the planning group, and then recommended to council, hey, there are some things we discovered in this process that we probably ought to address. We found some things in our articles of incorporation that make changes and doing things kind of troublesome and challenging, and we ought to just fix some of those things. We have some old articles of incorporation. It deserves some examination and work to update those and bring them into the current time frame, and make us be more effective and ready. Maybe we ought to learn more about what other denominations are like, because we see some of our brothers and sisters from other Christian Reformed churches who are leaving and then figuring out, now what do we do and where do we go? And ought we to have some conversation, and maybe it'd be good for us to learn what it means to be Christian Reformed, and what does it mean, how does that compare to other denominations, and that kind of thing. And so an ongoing process for that and beyond. So having said all that, it's up on the screen now. What does it mean for Hillside? And some of us can suggest that, and maybe you can ask that and or answer that for us. I think we can continue to be Hillside. and welcome people with differences of opinion into leadership on the council with certain parameters, right? So, Ron,
Yeah, I think
your
that's
comment?
been what we've tried to do, and to recognize, hey, this is, and again, this has been the position of the church Hillside from the beginning, so we haven't changed that. And in some ways, we're trying to say we're just trying to be who we've been, and so we're not becoming something different there. So it's really, yeah, trying to. Again, I think that it's become more and more true. As I look at it and talk to fellow pastors and so on, I think the easiest churches to pastor, this is way simplification, but it's easier to have a church where everybody either agrees on A or B. It's harder to have a church where you have some who agree on A and some who say B. It's easier to have a church where everybody is a Donald Trump Republican. And you can get up on a Sunday morning and blast the libertards and blast anybody who thinks that DEI is something other than from the devil, and you can, guess what? Everybody goes, amen. I don't think that's the church. I think for me, I want to be in a church where we have people who are going to be people who are Republicans and Democrats, because the truth is somewhere between. Both have parts of, and so I think the harder thing, I think what we've been trying to do is the harder thing of trying to say we're going to love each other, even though we're going to vote differently in the booth, even though we're going to feel differently on this question or that question. We're going to recognize that in Christ we have a deeper commitment to each other. And so that's what I feel like we want to try to continue to do. And like I say, it's just easier to have a church where everybody, or again, to take the side of we are affirming, and anybody who's not is just idiot conservatives who just hate people. It's just easier if you can just take an extreme position and everybody, and so sometimes people who take extreme positions say, yeah, I dare to speak the truth. Well, in some ways that's easier because you're going to just get rid of everybody who disagrees with you. Try to live with people who disagree with you. Now, there's a challenge. Try to love people who are different than you. There's a challenge. And that's, I think, where we often grow most in Christ, is having to recognize there's a reason why this person feels this way. How do we, I take the traditional position, but how am I going to love? I want it. As I look at it, one of the things I see is, again, it's just the case. We've had people who are homosexual who grew up here as kids. I want somebody who's, if they're 14 years old and they're struggling, I want to know their church. We have a position, but we're also going to love them no matter what. Right? And that's not going to be a question. And that they can come and be loved and not just chewed out and yelled at and told they're horrible. And I hope we can do that. So anyway, that's.
I have a couple of other thoughts about some implications too, so that I want to at least share that I believe are true. But what Ron said about, if that weren't important about how we can all live together, it wouldn't have been part of Jesus' high priestly prayer in John 17:21, where he said that they all may be one, so that the world will know. And that's what he prayed that, right, in his last prayer on earth, that they all may be one, so that the world will know. And wouldn't that be a beautiful thing? So that's my other editorial comment, that would be cool if we could learn to figure that out with and for each other. And any other questions or thoughts?
I have a question about synod a little bit. I never knew what a gravamen was before, but now that I
Me either.
know, it sounds like a pretty healthy thing, because like we've been saying, you don't want to all have the same mind, but you stretch each other, you challenge each other. And so that sounded like a good thing, and it doesn't seem like that was the problem, because the gravamen, you agreed not to voice it, not to teach it.
Right.
And it seems to me that that's what's been happening in some churches, and that's what this is a reaction to. So did Synod consider anything? I mean, it's almost like they went all or nothing, right?
Right.
Isn't there some middle ground where we could keep a gravamen but enforce it better?
Well, so it turns out not based on the decision, as I read it, that you have to resolve a gravamen within a certain time period, and you can't come in with a gravamen. You can't come in. You can have a gravamen develop afterward, but you can't come in the current.
Well, and I think to another way to answer that is, so part of what happens is it's like, okay, we don't want this to be a loophole that people can use to not agree. And I understand that and so on. But I think what happened is that they closed this without realizing that it had a number of other implications of kind of saying, yeah, but without deciding. I mean, it's been interesting. I've had conversations with pastors who've said, well, but I'm not talking about that. And I said, well, we haven't had that conversation. That's what we were trying to say is slow down. Let's not just decide gravamen yes or no. Let's decide what can and can't be in there. Because right now you just said no, and that doesn't, and they've already pulled, and it's already kind of recognized you have to pull back somewhat from that. But we need to have a conversation of, okay, so what's confessional? What does it mean? And how do we hold to it? So I don't know if we'll have that. The optimistic side of me says, I think we'll kind of, maybe there's hope that we can kind of say, okay, we've made the basic decision on this thing. Now let's talk about, did we cover too much with this? Did we go kind of an all or nothing? And we could have had, and some of it is, I looked at it and had, saying, I think that it could have been resolved without changing the way gravamens were handled. Others said, no way, it couldn't have. I don't know. And I think for the most part, we want to say when people were doing that, it was not an attempt to try to create problems. It was just an attempt to try to say, this is how because one of the things that happened is the church, this sounds strange, but the CRC came to a place where in 150 years really hadn't figured out what's our strategy to tell a church you're no longer affiliated with us. We've had strategies for churches to say we're no longer affiliated with a denomination, but for the denomination to say no, you've moved away from. There was no really clear process, and so that is still something to be talked about. And sort of like, how'd you get through 150 years of history without being able to? Well, I mean, what happened is churches just voluntarily, you have the Protestant Reformed folks who ended up saying, all right, we'll leave. Okay, so good. They didn't have to kick them out. They left. And so part of it was kind of, and there were a number of voices at Synod, even some very conservative folks who were saying, hey, let's recognize we got to figure out we have to figure out how to do this in a loving way. What does it mean if we say, nope, you can't hold to this and still be a part of us? Because there are things where we would all say that, right? If a CRC church would start to preach that Jesus never rose from the dead, that's not true. We'd say, oh, hold on, no, that's no longer within the family. But we haven't had a good way haven't really named how to do that. So I think there was in my view, it ended up going a little further here, and maybe we'll come back to kind of saying, okay, hold on, yeah, there is a way to sort of recognize we don't mean this with, of what fits where. Does that answer?
So that's a possibility.
I think so. Again, you've seen Synod now say, well, no, there is some wiggle room, and some people are saying, well, hold on, no, there's not. So that conversation will continue some.
So I think some for sure implications are that some people will see in this coming time when we're looking for office bearers for the coming year. There may be some people who will say, I don't want to mess with that. And I think there'll be some people who say, I don't want to consider, and will have that be an easy out to say, I don't want to be considered as an office bearer. And so I know that will be an implication. I know that some people have or are going to leave because they thought, it came out way too strong, and I wish it didn't come out too strong. And so some people have or will leave the church. I mean, I know that for a fact. I've had enough conversation with folks, so I know that. So that's an implication. We didn't go into this thinking that there wouldn't be any implications, but those are two that I foresee. Do any of you foresee any others?
They're just thoughts, reactions to the whole thing.
Or just in
Does
general.
council know what they will do if someone comes and says, okay, I have a real difficulty with this. I'm not gonna talk about it, but I have a relative or someone that I know that, that's gay. They're practicing that lifestyle. I love them. I think they're wrong, but I'm not willing to sign that in blood. That they're wrong, they're going to hell, that kind of thing. But I would like to serve. Do you know what you'll do with someone like that?
I don't. So here's the thing. I think these decisions will be made on a case-by-case basis. I shouldn't hit this because you're recording, so. I'm not used to this stuff.
Disguise.
Yeah. No, I meant hit the microphone. But my judgment would be if someone said exactly what you said, they'd be 100% fully welcomed to serve on council. I mean, I think the question is, where's that gradation? And some people talked about this in council. We talked about this as we're kind of making up case law as we go, and we've agreed in council that we'll listen to folks on an individual basis and say, sounds like that's okay. And I'm one voice, right? I'm one person. So, but if I heard that, my suspicion would be the council, as I've heard them reflect and react before, would say, absolutely, no question.
So we do leave, council will recognize our ability as individuals to say, I don't know, this is the way I feel. That I want to be welcoming to them. I'm not willing to, exclude them or make any judgments about their salvation about it. Do I agree with their lifestyle? No. To leave room for that, I guess basically, is council gonna take responsibility for Hillside and not, now maybe, like you've said, Synod backed off a little bit on their hard and fast, initially you have 6 months to figure this out. Now you have 3 years to figure it out. Now, well, maybe we need to revisit this. So we're saying we're gonna vote for the revisit this and we'll decide for us.
Yeah, I think our council has decided that the council will take it upon itself to examine those individual cases.
And just have a discussion with someone and say what's best.
Good.
And I think it's helpful to the denomination did not say, I don't think, of deciding whether someone is damned or not. because there are things that we have confessions. I mean, we don't say somebody. I don't think many CRC pastors, some I'm sure do, but most don't say, well, somebody who disagrees on infant baptism is wrong, is damned. And so I think we want to make sure we recognize that some in the denomination would say, yeah, this is an issue of, if you're wrong, you're going to hell. That's not what the whole denomination has said. You have to, trying to figure out where can you be wrong on this one and still, I have said, again, I said to somebody at Synod last year, I said, I don't think I'm going to score 100% on whatever theology exam we have to have when we get there, because I don't think any denomination's going to score 100%. I can give you, I said, I think we're all going to discover that we have some things, and so we have to have some grace in understanding that. So, and I think that's part of what makes Hillside is to say, we're not going to jump to anybody who disagrees with this is damned. We have our position, and we're going to let God, we're going to present that. We think this is what the Bible teaches, but there are a number of things where I don't want to make my being right on it the determination of where I go for eternity. If that scares some of you, well, I can tell you some pastors who are more sure of everything than I am, if you want to.
One of the reasons we came to Hillside is when we were searching for a church, we listened to a couple of online sermons. And I think I've told you this before, Ron, but one of them was Ron was preaching on heaven, and he multiple times said, "This is what I think. I'm not sure. I'm not sure of a lot of these things, and I don't think we'll ever know." And I found that so refreshing that he was willing to say, "I'm not sure," that it was one of the reasons that I wanted to come to Hillside. There were lots of others, but it wasn't just your being uncertain. There's a lot more about Hillside than just your uncertainty. But I think that's that's a part of kind of our of who we are. We believe certain things are true, right? And we declare them, and we're declarative about that. But we're understanding with other people, and I don't think I'm smart enough to know for sure on lots of things. So, I don't want to ignore you all on the screen. Some of you look nice, and some of you, are blacked out, and that might be on purpose. But any either questions or additions or other things that we should address? Anything we forgot? Okay, how about here? Any other things we missed? What you wish we'd have thought of, or?
I've got kind of a technical question, but does the decision to leave the day or leave the denomination or whatever that looks like solely rely on the council, or is it ever a position where it has to go for a congregational vote?
So that Ron knows more about church polity than I do, but if we would, I'm certain that if it ever came to the point of leaving the denomination, that would be a long conversation and educational process that would involve the whole congregation. I mean, probably the reality is that in church, I shouldn't even say this, in church polity, the council, congregational votes on most things are advisory, and the council, makes decisions. So I shouldn't have said that, but that's the reality. That's true.
But
So
I
be
think
careful who
actually
you select to be on the
leaving
council.
or being in the denomination, I think, is in the Articles of Incorporation, that's something the congregation does have to vote on. It certainly would be. I mean,
We'd be foolish.
so yeah, in that sense, that's not one that the council just announces.
It's not necessary to stay, though.
Right.
No, I mean, I mean, if enough people wanted to say, hey, we think you made the wrong call on that, council might well be wise to revisit it, but
Yeah. It did occur to me that it might have made some people uncomfortable that we even thought about these options, right? I suspect that it did. I mean, in fact, I know it did. And so if that makes people uncomfortable, but that's the reality, and that's why we thought it important that you know that we went through the process. And if it makes you uncomfortable, we can have more conversations about that. But
And to me, my thought on that one is that that's part of what the foresight scenario planning process does, is it forces you to be able to consider extremes so that you're not locking yourself in with cognitive bias. And I think the other thing it does is that, as Ron said earlier, the discussion's not done. Synod's going to continue to meet and debate. And as somebody earlier said, they're going to come back in 2 years, 2026, or a year and a half, with what does this mean for members? So let's just imagine for a minute that the Synod gets a report that says, well, if you're a member, you have to agree with every jot and tittle of not only the creeds, but the confessions. So everything in the Heidelberg Catechism, Canons of Dort, Belgic Confession. If you don't agree with infant baptism, you don't agree with the test of the Anabaptists, you can't be a member at Hillside. Well, then maybe we might be closer to making a recommendation to say, is this really, my point of view, a denomination that we'd want to stay part of? Where everybody, no matter if you're a background of a Catholic or a unchurched person or a Lutheran, has to agree with every single point? So that's why we thought it was important to at least consider that option, because what if? We don't know what Synod's going to do over the next 2 years, but you have to at least be ready so you're not caught flat-footed later on.
I thought you were Norm, you weren't making a point. All right. Others? We didn't rehearse this, how to close, but I'll close we open with prayer. I'll close in prayer.
all right,
How would that be?
that would be good.
But I don't want to cut off the conversation, but it felt like we were done. All right. Good. You can have conversation after the fact too. Questions after the fact that you think of later on, bring those up too. So shall we pray?
KenTamerling.com.
God and Father, thank you for the opportunities you give us to talk and be in fellowship. And most of all, thank you for the grace that you've given to each one of us. And that gives us the confidence to know that we can come before you and share our questions and our challenges, but also the confidence that we have in knowing that you are who you are to each of us, and that we are who we are because of our identity in you. Thank you for Hillside Church, for the folks who make all the details happen. We're thankful for leadership at both the staff and volunteer level that we're blessed with, and we're thankful for the congregation that is supportive in so many ways. Help us in the coming year as we seek to grow in you and make disciples and grow an authentic community. Thank you for this time, and continue to give us grace and knowledge and insight to be your followers in what we do. In Jesus' name, amen.